Hello learners, I am Dr. Sahabuddin Ahamed, Assistant Professor, Guest Faculty in the Department of English at Pandit Sundarlal Sharma Open University, Bilaspur, Chhattisgarh. Welcome you all to this virtual session. Today, I will explore the book The Empire Writes Back. This book is one of the most influential books in postcolonial studies. The book is written by Australian critics Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith, and Helen Tiffin. This seminal book provides a framework for understanding how formerly colonized writers, colonized societies respond to European colonial domination through literature. So, learners, by the end of this session, you will have a clear idea understanding the book's major concept, themes, and significance, and why this book remains relevant to in postcolonial study. To begin with, the book The Empire Writes Back, Theory and Practice in Postcolonial Literatures was published in the year 1989. Its authors are Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin. So they are pioneers in postcolonial theory, and this book is a foundational text in postcolonial theory and literature. This book examines how formerly colonized societies, countries, writers write back to the imperial center. The book emphasizes how writers from formerly colonized countries, including African countries, Asian, South African, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, nations challenge the dominance of European cultural tradition. So, instead of accepting dominant colonial narratives, these writers create their own histories, their own voices, reclaiming their identities, histories. Moreover, the book emphasizes the issue of rewriting resistance and cultural identity. The book establishes key terminology, theoretical frameworks. This book marks a turning point in literary studies, literary theory. The book shows us how literature becomes a site of cultural resistance. Now, on the next slide, we can see the aims of the book. The authors set out to establish a unified postcolonial theory. Their aim is to provide a theoretical framework for analyzing postcolonial text. The book exhibits the material and historical experiences of colonialism. The book helps us understand how European colonialism affected language, literature, identity. At the same time, the book highlights the counter strategies in postcolonial writing that asserts, recuperates, rewrites indigenous literature and histories. Essentially, the book demonstrates how it gives us tools to analyze postcolonial writers right back to the imperial center. That means how they dismantle and transform dominant colonial discourse narratives. The book highlights the process of decolonization, that means decolonizing language, literature, identity of the European colonizer. Finally, it integrates diverse postcolonial experiences into a unified conceptual field. Now, turning to the next slide, what is postcolonialism? It is important to understand what postcolonial is. Essentially, postcolonialism is a branch of contemporary theory that examines the cultural, economic, political, psychological effects of European colonialism upon the formerly colonized societies and the nature of those societies' response to colonialism, colonial impacts. Australian critics Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith, and Helen Tiffin defined the term postcolonial to cover all the cultures affected by the imperial process from the moment of colonization to the present day. Page number 2. Asia, Africa, Caribbean nations, Latin America, and Pacific island countries were once colonized by Britain and other European powers such as France, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands. The term colonial refers to the period before independence. Chronological definition of the term postcolonial is that it is the period after European colonialism, after independence, and the hyphenated definition of the term postcolonial used to put an emphasis on material and historical fact of colonialism. Page number 198. So, postcolonialism is a process, unfinished process in which colonized societies engaged with the colonizing power through different phases during and after the period of colonialism. Postcolonialism is a strategy of reading and writing that subverts, challenges European canons, discourse. For example, the reading of William Shakespeare's play The Tempest from non-European colonized perspective. So continuing from the previous slide, previous points, what is postcolonial literature? According to Ashcroft et al., the literatures of African countries, Asia, Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, Caribbean nations, India, Malaysia, Malta, New Zealand, Pakistan, Singapore, South Pacific Islands countries, Sri Lanka are all postcolonial literatures because of their emergence out of their experience of European colonization and their resistance to colonial power, subversion of the colonial power. Page number 2. Postcolonial focuses on multiple issues like power dynamics, cultural domination, resistance, ethnicity, identity formation, nationality, nationhood, hybridism, language, and the transformation of dominant colonial discourse narratives. So, all together form the complex field of the postcolonial study. Now, let us move on to the next slide, the key concepts in the book The Empire Writes Back. The authors introduce several key concepts in postcolonial literature discussed in the book The Empire's Write Backs. Firstly, one of the key concepts in this book is writing back method. Postcolonial writers write back to the imperial center, that means the cultural and literary response to colonial discourse and colonial authority. That means postcolonial writers challenging colonial discourse, colonial authority, and reclaiming their identity and history. They rewrite history and culture from their own viewpoint. For example, Jean Rhys White Sargasso Sea rewrites Charlotte Browne's novel Jane Eyre from the perspective of Bertha Mason, and Chinua Achebe rewrites Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness. So this is a direct act of cultural resistance, reclaiming the narrative that colonial literature once controlled, ignored. Postcolonial writing becomes an act of cultural resistance and reclamation. Now, secondly, the term colonial discourse refers to the language, narratives, and knowledge systems that colonizers used to justify European domination and colonization. From a single Eurocentric perspective, it denies the value of the colonizers' cultures, belief systems, societies. It depicts the colonized people as inferior, savage, and backward. For example, it uses binary oppositions, hierarchies to dehumanize and demonize the cultures of colonized countries. And colonial discourse maintains hegemony of European literature and culture. It denies the value of the margin periphery. Page number 4, according to Ashcroft et al. The European literature and societies are viewed as superior and civilized. However, Postcolonial literature writers challenges and subverts these dominant assumptions by representing their own cultures, histories, societies. So continuing from the previous points, thirdly, language of imperial center and language of power. So language becomes a tool of domination. Colonial text relationships to dominant ideology. For example, English, that is English language is a central concern in post-colonial studies, and language is a tool of resistance. It is a debate whether post-colonial writers should use the colonizer's language or native language. Chinua Achebe uses English completely, while Ngugi Thiong'o rejects English language completely. He advocates for using native African languages in order to preserve African cultural tradition, values and belief systems. So both writers seek to reclaim African cultural identity. So postcolonial writers challenges dominant colonial assumptions and perspectives. Fourthly, postcolonial identity. That means how colonized individuals and societies redefine themselves after colonization, reclaiming their identity, history, cultures, belief system. The postcolonial identity in many ways fluid, hybrid and cross-cultural that shows the influence of both native and European cultural tradition. Fifthly, the term hybridity introduced by Homike Bhabha, it refers to the mixing and impurity of all cultures. Under colonial influence, it shows the influence of both cultural traditions, Western and non-Western. That means a person belongs to more than one culture and space. Culture is not pure, static, homogeneous, fixed. Rather, it is a process of exchange, negotiation, transformation, mobility, and hybridity produce new cultural identities, new cultural forms, expression. It challenges rigid categories of colonized and colonizer. Writers like Salman Rushdie, Derek Walcott show hybridized identities in their postcolonial literary works. Finally, syncreticity refers to the dynamic and ongoing process of cultural mixity. That means culture is a matter of process rather than culture is a fixed or static one. Now dear learners, next I would like to discuss language in postcolonial literature. The Empire Writes Back emphasizes the role of language in postcolonial literature and theory. English is seen as a dominant language, it is the colonial language, and postcolonial writers use it as a language of expression. They appropriate the English language by transforming it through the local and regional varieties, idioms, rhythm and structures. Postcolonial writers use English language to assert cultural identity. Neologism, how postcolonial writers reshape English syntax, idioms, words, phonology to express local cultural identity, local cultural system. It is the newly created or indigenized words that blends both colonial and indigenous languages. That means no cultural Athens but cultural hybridity, linguistic hybridity. That is Africanized English, Indian English, Igbo words, Hindi and Tamil words into English text. For examples, some words like mouth, law. So postcolonial writers use code switching, that is the switch between two or more codes. For example, Pidgin and Creoles in the Caribbean literatures. Postcolonial writers use hybrid literary forms, that is the code switching, vernaculars, magic realism, historiographic metafiction, Indian English, Caribbean English, intertextuality, non-linearity method strategy in literature. For example, Salman Rushdie in his novel Midnight Children blends realism, myth, history, politics, satire. So there are linguistic groups, monolinguistic, that is a single community, for example English as a native language, diglossic English as the language of the government, commerce and literature in the countries like India, Africa, and polyglossic, that is regional and standard varieties of English found in the Caribbean literature. Postcolonial writers reclaim indigenous language, indigenous storytelling, oral traditions. So therefore, language becomes a tool of both oppression from colonizers' perspective and empowerment from the colonized perspective. Now let us examine some textual strategies in postcolonial literature. Postcolonial writers use multiple strategies to resist colonial domination. Empire writes back, that is first used by Salman Rushdie. Postcolonial writers write back to challenge the authority and assumptions of European imperial culture and literature. The second strategy is appropriation. It refers to how postcolonial writers reshape English of the imperial center by transforming it through local and regional varieties, idioms, rhythm and structures to express local cultural identity. For example, Caribbean writers using Creole and Pidgin and English together. Next, the abrogation refers to how postcolonial writers reject the authority or privilege or authenticity of the colonial language, that is English language. That means they deny its authenticity, rigid category, assumption, universal truth claim, values. For example, Chinua Achebe rejects standard English norms by inserting Igbo proverbs, Igbo words into the narrative into his novel. Salman Rushdie refused to use standard English and instead he creates Indianized English. For example, Gundas, TikTok Wala. Also, Sam Sullivan uses Creole and Pidgins in his novel, in his drama. There is a tension between the abrogation of the received English, which speaks from the center, and the act of appropriation, which brings it, that means English, under the influence of vernacular tongue. The complex of speech habits which characterize the local language. Page number 38. This is the quote from the book The Empire Writes Back. According to Raja Rao, Indian writer, one has to convey in a language that is not one's own the spirit that is one's own. So in the sense of abrogation and appropriation of the English language, postcolonial writers appropriate English in order to express their identities. They reject the rules of grammar and style of the English language. So these techniques challenge the dominance of colonial literary tradition. So continuing from the previous points, postcolonial writers code switch, that is switching between languages to assert their cultural identity. Indigenization, that is indigenous pre-colonial literary cultural forms that abrogate Eurocentric cultural values. For example, text in Tamil, Bengali, Kannada, Urdu, Hindi forms. Hybridization. According to Ashcroft et al., the postcolonial text is always a complex and hybridized formation. Page number 108. It is the impossibility of returning to pure, authentic or pre-colonial cultural tradition in the former colonized societies. Decolonization. Postcolonial writers use English as a tool for reclaiming suppressed histories. It provides a platform for expressing cultural resistance and identity by rewriting, recuperating, revisiting indigenous myths, legends, histories. Postcolonial writers reconstruct a sense of community and belonging rooted in nationalism, nationhood, national consciousness. So it becomes an act of political liberation and cultural reclamation. Now in the next slide, we will discuss some frameworks in postcolonial literary theory. So the authors explore analytical frameworks, that is how to analyze colonial periods, colonial cultural encounters, colonial discourses from colonized perspective, discursive frameworks, used for the analysis of contemporary cultural, political and economic relations. Postcolonial discourse is counter discourse rather than homogeneous or monolithic. Hybridity, it is the dynamic relationship between European and indigenous cultural systems. It blends multiple cultures and identities. Mimicry refers to how non-Western peoples become mimic men by assuming, imitating Western cultures, manners, languages, education system, dress, and they both resist and undermined colonial authority. Othering or otherness refers to the process of becoming other, being other, inferior, or it is the process of being different from Europeans in order to establish European colonial supremacy. The theme of marginality is the condition of being othering or constructing othering, racial identity exclusion, marginally constructed by the privileged culture. The term diaspora refers to the dispersal of peoples due to the consequences of European colonization. How it is done? It is done through slavery, migration, exile, indentured, transnational border crossing. Cultural difference, the term cultural difference refers to the distinction between colonized and colonizer culture. That means European culture is civilized while non-European culture as backward or primitive. Now moving on to the major themes in post-colonial literature. Dear learners, the book The Empire Writes Back explores recurring themes in post-colonial literatures and theory. The book unveils the relationship between colonizer and colonized, center and margin, self and other, white and black, west and east, the silencing and marginalizing of the post-colonial voice by the imperial center, the abrogation of this imperial center within the text, and the active appropriation of the language and culture of that center. Page number 82. Cultural difference, that means how native culture is different from the culture of the imperial power, European powers. The term colonial discourse, it is the influence of the colonizers' language and culture upon the life of the post-colonial societies, post-colonial peoples, subjects. Cultural resistance, that means how post-colonial writers assert native cultural sensibilities, how they question universal values of a imperial culture that devalue indigenous culture and identity. So it is an attempt to restore lost dignity, humanity of their nation, culture and identity. So post-colonial writers challenge imperial assumptions, imperial ideologies, imperial perspectives, Eurocentric perspective. They offer non-Eurocentric perspective, colonized perspective. The term settler colonies refers to the process of permanent settlement of European colonizers and the displacement of indigenous peoples and the imposition of colonial culture upon the non-European ones. For example, Australia, Canada, South Africa, United States and Israel are all examples of settler colonies. Continuing, relation between self and place violated by colonial encounters. The term displacement resulting from migration, trade, resettlement and the mixture of European and indigenous cultural tradition. That is the conscious and unconscious oppression of the indigenous personality and culture by a supposed superior racial or cultural model. So cultural displacement, it is the disruption of culture, identity, way of life by colonization. Cultural displacement highlights how colonized people experience a loss of their cultural tradition, belief systems, how they feel alienated from their cultural heritage due to the imposition of colonizers' culture and language, due to the exploitation oppression caused by European colonization. Due to how their cultural system governance replaced by European colonizers. As a result, colonized people are caught between two cultural traditions, Western and native. So as a result, their workers' crisis of identity. So postcolonial subjects are torn between native and Western tradition. That's why there is the crisis of identity that the postcolonial writers face, that they explore in their literary works. Nationalism and national literature rooted in national consciousness. It is centered on homogeneous national tradition that reject the assumptions of universal values of dominant imperial culture. It questions essentialist cultural identity and the theme of decolonization. It is the process of returning to pre-colonial cultural tradition based on cultural purity, national consciousness, homogeneity, and the theme of rewriting history, that means rewriting the history of colonized societies and culture. Gender and colonialism, that means how European colonial powers feminized colonized lands, peoples, and describing them as weak, passive, justifying colonial domination. Colonized women suffered double subjugation by colonial power and second by patriarchal structures within their own societies, by their own communities. The term transculturalism, it is the ongoing cultural flows that transcend the boundaries of the nation states and it dismantle the rigid binary of colonizer and colonized. So it focuses on the fusion of cultures, mixity of culture. Cultural synchronicity refers to the cross-cultural relationship, cultural mixity, cultural fusion, dismantling the rigidity between the cultures. Culture is not pure or static. Now let us shift our focus on some notable post-colonial writers. So from Africa, the writers Chinua Achebe, Ul Soyinka, and from South Asia, Rajarao, R.K. Narayan, Salman Rushdie, Anita Desai. From the Caribbean, the writers Wilson Harris, Derek Walcott, Jean Rhys, V.S. Naipaul, George Laming, Samuel Sylvan, and Edward Brathwaite. From Canada, there is the writer Margaret Atwood, and along with indigenous literature. From Australia, Patrick White, Peter Carey, Henry Lawson, Judith Wright, and Aboriginal writing. From New Zealand, the writer Janet Frame. These writers demonstrates the theories of writing back, resistance, and cultural reclamation discussed in the book. For example, Chinua Achebe reshapes English to tell Igbo culture's African identity. Ngugi Thiong'o writes in Gikuwa to reject colonial control. Salman Rushdie in Midnight Children introduced hybrid identities. Jean Rhys rewrites British colonial text. Derek Walcott blends European and Caribbean cultural tradition. So their works, novels, poems provide concrete examples of how post-colonial literature write back to the imperial center to reflect lived experiences of formerly colonized people and how they challenge dominant colonial assumptions perspective. Now dear learners, now let us look at the next slide, that is the critique of the work. However, the book is not without criticism despite its significance. Some scholars charge that the book places too much emphasis on language rather than material and historical realities. The book generalizes different colonial experiences under one umbrella. There are debates about its universal applicability across all post-colonial contexts. The book puts an emphasis on English language text while marginalizing, excluding non-English literary text. That's why the rejection. Moreover, the book raises questions about the ongoing influence of colonial structure in the contemporary world, modern world. Now focusing on the significance of the book The Empire Writes Back. The Empire Writes Back has had a profound impact because the book has helped establish postcolonial studies as an academic discipline, academic field. In many countries before this book, postcolonial writers were ignored or treated as marginal. After the publication of the book, their works became central to postcolonial literary studies. It became a foundational text in postcolonial literary studies. The book introduced key terminology. The book encouraged reading literature from third world countries or colonized countries, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, and the book expanded the literary canon by introducing literature from these formerly colonized countries. The book continues to influence contemporary literary criticism. The book also encouraged scholars to rethink about cultural identity, cultural politics, nationalism, diaspora, transnationalism, and cultural politics. Now coming to conclusion, The Empire Writes Back shows that literature is not just artistic expression. Literature can be a political act. The book provides a framework for understanding how literature becomes a site of resistance and identity formation. The book emphasizes how formerly colonized societies reclaim their voices, recuperate the lost histories, lost identities through the strategy writing back. The book highlights the creative and political power of postcolonial writers, postcolonial literature. The book encourages readers to question and challenge dominant literary traditions, perspectives, ideology, and it also encourages readers to embrace diverse multiple voices, assumptions. And the book shows the lasting impacts of colonialism upon the formerly colonized societies, how these societies were influenced by the European colonization. So that's all for today, dear learners. Now we have completed the topic The Empire Writes Back, and soon we will meet again with another video. Thank you for watching and listening to this lecture.